On today's Inspire, a historical feature about the Underground Railroad and the important role that Kansas played in the efforts to help enslaved African Americans in their search for freedom. Stay with us.
Inspire is sponsored by Kansas Furniture Mart, using furniture to inspire conversation. And by the Blanche Bryden Foundation.
The Friends of KTWU, honored to support programs and services that enrich the lives of our viewers.
And the Raymond C. and Marguerite Gibson Foundation.
Hello and welcome to Inspire. I'm pleased to be here with my co-hosts Amber Dickinson and Betty Lou Pardue. And today we're going to discuss the important role that Kansas played in a piece of American history that will never be forgotten.
Kansas is home to 21 Underground Railroad Network to Freedom sites. While it was not technically a railroad, nor was it underground, it provided a secret path to freedom.
Many brave Kansans placed themselves at risk to assist enslaved African Americans in their journeys north. Joining us today to discuss this is Kelly Erby. She is the Assistant Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences and History Professor at Washburn University. We are so glad you're here, Kelly. Thank you so much for joining us for Inspire. What enthralls you the most about the Underground Railroad?
I think I'm really inspired by the enslaved African Americans who made this, decision to risk everything and go for freedom. And I think too often we talk about the people who assisted them, but many enslaved people just went on their own without any help. And just I think their courage and bravery is really inspiring.
Talk about the Underground Railroad, because on a national TV show, a person of color said, "Hey, where can I find the railroad?" And I'm like, oh my God, really? Did you just ask that? Mm-hmm. So tell us about exactly what it was.
Yeah, and so I can see why there's confusion about it, but so it wasn't actually a railroad, right? Mm-hmm. But it was a system of way houses or safe houses or just safe places. They weren't necessarily houses always, where enslaved people who were on the run, going toward freedom, could get help, get assistance, sometimes with shelter or food or information. I think that's really important. I think more than like a physical place, it was a network, right? It was a network of people who were ready to assist and help in any way that they could.
So how was information passed around about where these sites were located? How could enslaved people who were seeking freedom get information about where they could get assistance?
So sometimes it was people, like there were people who were in the area who might have information that they could help with. Sometimes it was information that was passed among enslaved people themselves, and oftentimes that was through coded songs or coded ways of talking. I mean, just the Underground Railroad itself, right, is kind of a coded way of talking about something. Mm-hmm. So it was passed along in secret or rumor, and people just knew that they could get assistance or they could get help.
So in addition to finding out the good information, I would assume this sort of information network would also provide information about where you should avoid.
Right, yeah, that's a good point, yeah. Places where you shouldn't go, or people who were, because especially after the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, there was more incentive for slave catchers.
Right.
And so that's a good point. Information about, slave catchers being in the area, this is a bad time to do anything, to make a run for it.
I would assume that the bad information was just as important as the good information.
Yeah,
right.
I'm sure
even
that it
more
was.
So, yeah. Even more so at times. Okay, so we're talking in Missouri and eastern Kansas, of course. So there's so many sites, so many people involved. you would be in trouble if you were caught helping an enslaved person. In what way?
Yeah, okay, so that's a really important question. So, okay, and I think, I don't want to get too complicated here, but I think it's important to realize that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 set out more penalties for helping enslaved people run away, right? So nationally, you could face a fine, you could face up to 6 months in prison for helping someone run away from slavery. In Missouri, for example, the stakes were even higher. The penalties were even worse. You could face 5 to 10 years in prison.
Wow.
And then in Kansas Territory, it was even worse than that. Under the fraudulently elected pro-slavery territorial government, you could face 10 years of hard labor or even death for assisting enslaved people in running away. So the stakes were really, really high. Also, there was a lot of incentive for people to apprehend runaway enslaved people, or even people who weren't necessarily fugitive, but they could be represented as being runaways. So you could get $50 to $100 for bringing someone and saying this is a runaway slave. You could get rewarded.
Punishment to the slave as well, auctioned off from their family.
Yes, I mean, torture, immediate sale often. I mean, really, they could do anything they wanted to them, essentially.
Because they were treated like chattel.
Yes, or worse than chattel.
Yes. Tell us who Harriet Tubman is.
Okay, so Harriet Tubman, a name that I think many of us are familiar with, hopefully. She was herself an enslaved woman who ran away and made it to freedom. But she came back, and we know that she came back 19 times to help others, members of her families, people in her community, run away and get to freedom. And so that's pretty remarkable, right? 19 times.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
and then later she goes on to be a spy for the United States during the Civil War, and she received military honors for that work.
Yeah.
So sort of touching on this element of this sort of spy element of what this is. A network is going to have people looking at it for information to give to people who are opposed to the mission of the network, right?
Sure.
So with the kinds of laws that were being passed and the monetary incentives to capture enslaved people, was it sort of creating this culture amongst people who were willing to be offering assistance to enslaved individuals? Were they at risk of being sort of told on by people in their communities?
That's a good question, and I'm sure that they were. I think in Kansas Territory, people tended, not always, but they tended to settle in like-minded communities. So you had clusters of Free State people and clusters of pro-slavery people. But yeah, I think you were always at risk of being told on. Mary Jane Ritchie, for example, I think she was very conscientious of who was watching her at her house, which was a stop on the Underground Railroad here in Topeka. She was always on the lookout to make sure that people didn't see her assisting the enslaved people, and I think that's very much why.
And I think on the houses themselves or the places, wasn't there like a candle or some kind of a...
Yeah, there were different symbols. You might put a candle in the window or hang a lantern up, outside your door, things like that to show that you were a safe house.
And about how many in Kansas were there?
I think there are 21 known sites, I believe, but I'm sure there could have been more.
I'm so curious as to the ones that we don't know about. There had to have been more, right? We just don't know because history has a way of getting lost, especially with things like this, when so much of what happened was storytelling, right? Our family did this during this period of time, and after a while, that's going to get lost. So I'm sure there are more that we just don't know about.
Yeah, and especially because this was criminal activity that you really didn't want people to know you were engaged in. So yeah, absolutely, I bet there were more.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and we're going to be back to continue our discussion with Kelly. Please stay with us.
And we're back. Ladies, in our last discussion, we started talking about the Underground Railroad and talking about Harriet Tubman, and I want to get us back to sort of the Kansas Underground Railroad. So how were the conditions on the Kansas Underground Railroad different than other areas in the country?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's a few differences. One, I mentioned already that the stakes were higher and the penalties were higher for assisting. I also think that it's important to remember that for at least part of the time that the Underground Railroad functioned in Kansas Territory was a war zone, particularly like 1856 to 1857. So I think that also just heightened the danger involved. Also, it was a less settled area, right, than say parts of Kentucky or that sort of thing. And so you had farther to go to get to the next safe house. And so I think it was more common to have actual trains, again, not real trains, but clusters of people who would wait at a safe house until there were a sufficient number of people because they had so much farther to go and the stakes were so much higher. So it functioned, I think the conditions made it function differently than back east.
Right. Now, women had such a huge role in the actual networking. Expand on that, please.
Sure. So women were often the ones who provided cover, right? Or they were often the ones who might care for, provide for the people who they were hiding. And so that put a lot of pressure on them, I think, because they needed to provide that care while also acting normally, going about their, not drawing attention to themselves. So I think that there was a lot riding on their shoulders.
What about the psychological ramifications of participating in this? Because I can't imagine from an enslaved person's perspective what they had gone through up to that point and then ending up on this journey through a war zone. Can you speak at all to what a person's reaction to that from an emotional perspective might be?
I can only imagine, right? And I can imagine, the anxiety and the trauma involved. And, some of these people, even some of the most famous stories that we know about, like with John Brown leading fugitives in 1858, for example, that journey took from mid-December until mid-March of that's just a long time to be on the run and to be unsettled. In that particular case, there was a pregnant woman who gave birth while she was on the run, right? And so, those are things that I like.
How do you even imagine that?
Right.
And I would imagine those psychological impacts are generational, handed down. We're living this way because we lived in this period of utter horror and terror. And so I would imagine that the ramifications of that experience echoes throughout generations of families that had people going through that.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. And there's been some interesting work on that. I like to talk to my students about like the grit and the determination and how much it must have taken to hold on to your humanity and to sort of focus on that instead of just the negative.
Let me talk about exodusters and the connection between that and the Underground Railroad, because I have family members who were exodusters who came to Kansas. So I want to know if there was a correlation between the two.
Yeah, I think there was a correlation because I think Kansas Territory and then the state of Kansas developed this reputation, rightly or wrongly, as a more progressive place, the land of John Brown, right? The land of these daring escapes and the free state, right? And so I think that all contributed to exodusters targeting Kansas after Reconstruction falls apart. To escape to, right? To flee from the South where they're not going to get rights and opportunities, and they put their hope in Kansas.
Do we know how many people were in the system in terms of the Underground Railroad? Do we know, to have a little bit of an estimate?
Yeah, so we have estimates. Like in Kansas Territory, we think that maybe 800 to 1,000 people fled via the Underground Railroad. Might have been a lot more than that. I also have read that there were more people who didn't necessarily use the assistance of a formalized Underground Railroad who still came through Kansas Territory, and we don't know their numbers. These are all really just guesses.
I'd like to hear more about your students. How do they react? Your students, college age, late teens, early 20s. How have they reacted to learning about this? What are their thoughts?
That's a good question. I think my students are often, not all students, but I think some students are really hungry to know more about U.S. history. I think sometimes they feel like it's not taught. accurately in some of the public schools, and they want a less whitewashed version of U.S. history. It's important to me to emphasize like the ways in which enslaved people helped themselves, as opposed to depending on white people in the Underground Railroad. So I can't say that I really talk a lot about the Underground Railroad, but we do talk about it because I think that there are examples. It's an example of ways in which individuals can really make an important difference, can really like make a difference. And so, I do always include it to some extent.
So on that same topic, when we see whitewashing in our textbooks and in schools, which we obviously are seeing, what kind of impact does that have on students and their ability to really learn and understand American history?
Well, yeah, I think sometimes there's a distrust of what they're learning. I think if we don't teach it accurately, we don't prepare students to confront the world we live in now and the very real problems that we have now.
Do you think students are uncomfortable to talk about these topics?
Many students are.
Yeah, why is that?
And other students, though, are so hungry to talk about it.
Right.
And so it's interesting in the classroom to sort of try to navigate different levels of like sort of preparedness and willingness to talk openly about what are, admittedly hard topics, but also I get that they're hard topics, but then on top of that, they've been politicized in ways that are really unfortunate. So I think it's really important to build community in the classroom so that you can have these conversations.
Well, and unfortunately, Black history gets relegated to the shortest month of the year. So, and then there are people who contend, why do you even need a month as opposed to, other people getting 365 in terms of history. So I think it's important to bring that up and always keep that in front of people's minds that, look, this was a thing and we're still dealing with the implications of
absolutely.
it, even in 2022.
Right, and now we're seeing it again in other political ways, an Underground Railroad of sorts for immigrants, for the whole abortion issue from other states. There's so many things, so much more we could talk about, but Kelly, thank you so much for being with us today on Inspire. The Underground Railroad and the brave individuals who helped freedom seekers are a part of American history nobody should ever forget. Danielle and I are thrilled to be speaking with Judy Sweets, an historian and researcher from Lawrence, Kansas. And I'm telling you, Judy, it's a delight. You have been doing research for 15 years. If you could please tell us briefly, what is the Underground Railroad and why did you get interested in it?
Okay, well, the Underground Railroad is not really a railroad. That's just they used railroad terms for getting freedom seekers moved along the path north to freedom, because during the 1850s and even before, people were enslaved and on plantations, and abolitionists, wanted to help move them, and they themselves wanted to sometimes escape on their own from some of the plantations. So abolitionists started Underground Railroad stations, either in their house, a barn, or loft, cellar, all kinds of places, and they used, like I said, they used railroad terms. For example, the freedom seekers, what we call for the escaped slaves, or the freedom seekers, and they use terms like station for where, it might be a barn, they call that the station, kind of like a railroad station. Depot is when somebody had a charge of a whole group of stations. We had around 30 here in Lawrence and Douglas County. And let's see, what else? Passengers, station master, and then anyway, they're just lots. And then for Canada, they would use the word Canaan. And they had code words that you had to say when you're knocking at the door, bringing someone to the next station. They'd usually knock on the door and said, "Who's there?" And they'd say, "A friend with friends."
Talk about the connection to Canada, because I don't think I'd ever heard about that until seeing the research that you've done.
Yes. Well, Canada, see, during the 1850s and even earlier, people were really not free. I mean, if they wanted to get on the Underground Railroad, I mean, the slave catchers were everywhere, and they were, captured them, and then they'd get money back. They'd get $200 back for every slave that they would take back to the slaveholder. And so really, I mean, we tried to move them out of Kansas, and they'd come through from Missouri, mainly. The Missouri slaves would come over to Kansas. They heard about Lawrence, then that was a free state town. But they didn't want to leave them here they sometimes had to before the abolitionists were able to raise enough money to move them further north. But so some of them went to Iowa, and there were Quakers up there that had Underground Railroad stations, and they kept them for a while. But the only really safe place before, the Civil War was Canada. So, they'd take them up through Detroit and go across at Windsor, Canada, and that's where they would be safe.
Okay, now you live close to a couple of Underground Railroad sites in Lawrence, but tell us about Grover Barn.
Okay, the 1858 Grover Barn is one of the best documented Underground Railroad sites in Kansas, and maybe even in the nation. That's the one when it was built in, like I said, 1858 on a 160-acre farm, and it's about 3 miles southwest of Lawrence, the city of Lawrence. And Joel Grover lived there with his wife, Emily, and they that was one of 10 known Underground Railroad stations in Lawrence, and today it's one of only 2 Underground Railroad structures that are still standing in the city of Lawrence. So we've lost quite a few of the stations, but we still have the stories. And so there were 2 groups that we know of definitely came through there. Was the group with John Brown, they had 12 freedom seekers with John Brown that stayed there several days. And then there were 2 teenage boys who were living on Vermont Street, sheltered there in a house, and it's kind of a sad story. They just didn't want to stay inside. They wanted to go outside and be in the sunshine for a little while. Sure. They were, like I said, teenagers, 14 and 17. And the lady that was taking, there, Mrs. Abbott, she said, "No, you can't go out. People might see you." And so one of them he had to go outside. He just wanted to go out in the sun in the backyard for a while. And later on, she told her husband they did that. And so he said, well, they're going to have to be moved tonight, because I'm sure someone may have seen them. Right. The neighbors may have seen them and tell the slave catchers. And so they moved them into Grover Barn.
Right. Well, then were they safe? Were they safe then?
They eventually got to, they kept moving them to different stations.
Okay.
Yes, until try to get them to Canada, if possible, or Iowa, either one.
Do we have an idea of how many people went through the Underground Railroads in Kansas?
Well, I can tell you about Lawrence. They said between 300 and 1,000, they think, came through. I guess it was Douglas County on the Underground Railroad. That was Dr. Sheridan's estimate. And
was Lawrence the main hub in terms of Underground Railroads? I know that it being more of a free area, was it like the main place for the Underground Railroads?
Yes, and the people in the plantations in Missouri, they would, they passed it kind of like a grapevine. They would, if one person knew about it, this is a safe place to go, and that's a free state town. And then the people that owned them kept saying such terrible things about Lawrence so they thought that's where we're going to go, because they don't like those abolitionists over there. So
this is fascinating. Judy, thank you so much. And we hope this has piqued your interest to find out more about the Underground Railroad.
Ladies, what a powerful discussion about the Underground Railroad and the role that Kansas played in helping enslaved African Americans. What did you learn from today's conversation?
I'm just so thankful that I did not have to do that. Living in fear, constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering if you were going to be killed, captured, what?
I think something that I think about when I'm lucky enough to have conversations with people who know so much about these topics is that I need to accept that I'm a privileged individual because I'm white, and part of my responsibility is to educate myself and listen to people who have experiences that I have never had to go through because I'm not a minority in this country.
Mm-hmm. And when you say that, what does that mean to you to say privilege?
It means that because I was born white in America, I have privilege, that things are not hard for me in the way that things are hard for people when they're black or brown. And that doesn't mean I am a bad person. Mm-hmm. That means it is my responsibility to accept and understand that and to learn and do better.
Mm-hmm. This is a conversation that's very hard for me because I have family members that were exodusters who came here from Mississippi.
Explain what an exoduster is, because I'm afraid people might not know.
They were people who left Mississippi back in the 18 whatevers and came to Kansas with the idea of settling on free land at one particular time. And so I'm fifth generation Kansan. And the settlement that we lived in was called Dunlap, and it was basically majority African American settlement in eastern Kansas. And to think about what they had to go through and what my, even talking to my grandmother and great grandmother, who I was raised by, their stories. A lot of this is not necessarily triggering, but kind of triggering and troubling to me.
Sure.
Because again, sometimes we talk about this as a far off thing, but there are still repercussions that we're dealing with in 2022. And I hope people understand that it's not just a historical thing. It's something that a lot of people of color are dealing with to this day. And just some sensitivity needs to be had by everybody in terms of that.
Do you think people are hesitant to accept that these are still things that black people face today?
Yes,
Why?
absolutely. Because nobody wants to think about ugliness.
Right.
We think that we've evolved. We think we've gotten all past that, and it's 2022, but it's in some ways we've gone a little bit backwards.
Right.
And that's very concerning to me. So there's definite conversations that need to be had. But people need to have conversations, not be on the defense about having conversation, because you could say, well, that wasn't my family. That's not the point. It's society.
Right.
It's the way things are still set up that people of color still have to battle with to this day. And people have to be open to having those conversations.
Right. Listen and learn.
Yes.
And take action.
And not be defensive about it. Maybe your family wasn't involved in it, but again, it's systematic, and we got to figure out how to take care of this so that everybody has equality, civil rights for all.
That's right. That's right. We could do this forever. I don't want to stop, but we have to because that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to watch this program again or any KTWU program, you can do that online at watch.ktwu.org.
And if you are so inspired to learn more about our wonderful guest, find out what is coming up on future shows, and get access to additional content, be sure to visit our website, www.ktwu.org/inspire.
Inspiring women, inspiring freedom, inspiring you on KTWU. Thank you for watching.
Inspire is sponsored by Kansas Furniture Mart, using furniture to inspire conversation, and by the Blanche Bryden Foundation.
The Friends of KTWU, honored to support programs and services that enrich the lives of our viewers.
And the Raymond C. and Marguerite Gibson Foundation.